One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. So I feel like for the past few weeks, I've been creating content around podcast interviews, but y'all, it's so important. It's what everyone keeps asking me about. So why wouldn't I keep answering everyone's questions? Because it's not like it's one person has asked me about setting up podcast interviews or how do you conduct them? What are the steps involved in the process? Like, there are so many questions I get all the time from different people about podcast interviews. So today I wanted to specifically talk about the podcast interview mindset, because there are certain things that I think about when I'm conducting a podcast interview, and I want to share those with you today just to give you kind of an insight if you are thinking about getting started with interviews, or you just got started and you want to make sure that you're on the right track. Then I think that this episode is really going to help you. So let's dive right in. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been thinking about creating a podcast for a while, well, I'm so glad you found this show. Think of this as the shortcut / time-saving version of searching Google and YouTube for hours and hours trying to figure out the world of podcasting. Trust me, as a busy mama of 3, I get it. You don't have a lot of time to be spent, or wasted, I should say, searching the web, trying to find all the right ideas and all the amazing things that are out there, and you just end up overwhelmed. Trust me, I've been there, done that, took home the souvenir. But this podcast is going to help you in practical ways, because twice a week we'll be delivering episodes that are going to give you steps to help you create a podcast your audience can't wait to listen to. So let's get right to it, shall we? Have you been wanting to start a podcast? You've been thinking about it. It feels right. You just know this is the next thing that my business needs. Well, I encourage you to sign up for my 5-day podcast bootcamp. This is a thing that you have been looking for. It is a 5-day video series where I walk you through exactly how to start, launch, and market your podcast, and I throw in some more information about planning strategies and being consistent and how you can make the most out of your podcast from day one. So sign up for our 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp at crystalprofit.com/podcastbootcamp. And do it already. You know that you've been wanting to, so just bite the bullet and join us. So like I said in the beginning, it's funny to talk about the podcast interview mindset like it's always been a thing for me, and it hasn't because I didn't realize I had a certain mindset around doing podcast interviews until someone asked me, how do you conduct a podcast interview? And it wasn't until then that I realized there are some really specific things that I do every single time in order to get ready for an interview. But I was just doing these things on autopilot, guys. Like I didn't realize that there was a system, like a method to the madness until someone actually asked me, well, what do you do? And can you tell me how to do those things? So in a second, I'm going to tell you all about the actual interview process, like not the setup, because I recently did a YouTube video and you can go watch that. It is all about a podcast interview setup and how to just get everything in order, everything from scheduling and conducting the interview and what you need to do while you're actually talking to someone. So we're not going to get into those details today. We're going to talk about the actual mindset that happens while you're speaking to someone and you're actively interviewing them. So the first thing I want to cover is, how do you prepare to talk to someone that you've never actually met in person? So I want to help you feel at ease because I know a lot of you have either never conducted an interview yet, or you've only talked to people that you know. Maybe it's your friends and your family or other people in your industry that you kind of like you're already an acquaintance, but you don't know all the people that you're going to interview. So I want to address having an interview with someone that you've only interacted with through email or messenger, because honestly, this is most of my interviews. I don't know everyone that I've interviewed outside of the realm of my podcast. Like, that's just being totally honest. Some of them, some of my very first interviews that I did are people that I've known either all my life or for several years. But then kind of once you extend all of your resources, right? Like that's what I tell my students, what I tell my clients, like start within your own network and try to find people that you already know, because you're going to feel more comfortable with them. But I'm talking about once you've already used those resources and you're looking to branch out to other experts within your industry, then this episode is for you, because I know you probably only talked to them a few times through email or messenger and you're like, So I want to say the first thing is I want you to know it is 100% normal to feel nervous. It is. Like, it's part of it. I mean, you're doing something new for the first time. Now, 20 interviews in, you'll feel more confident. Or even 5 interviews in, you're going to feel more confident. You still may be nervous. I've done interviews where I'm still nervous, but I just wanted to throw that out there and say, if you haven't done any interviews and you're feeling a little nervous about it, totally normal. Totally normal. So, and I still get nervous before interviews, depending on my guests. And I've been doing this for over 85 episodes now. So I just really want to hit home that there's nothing wrong with you. If you're nervous, you just need to do more interviews in order to have more confidence in your interviewing skills and all the processes that are involved. So, but just like I said a few episodes ago, where we talked about knowing your why and how that can help you stay consistent with your podcast, in the case of podcast interviews, I want you to remember how your guests can add value to your podcast and to your audience. So when you stop to think about that and you focus on the value that you're giving your audience, like as a conversation with you and this other person, then all of the nerves, like everything that you feel, all that nervousness doesn't feel so overwhelming, right? Because you have the bigger picture in mind. You're not just like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous, I'm going to sound stupid, or I don't want to, seem like an idiot in front of this other person. I want to put my best foot forward. I want to, do the right thing. I want to be amazing. This is my first podcast interview. Like, I get it. But if you focus on all of those things, like, oh my gosh, like I'm sweating and I don't know if I'm going to be too loud. I don't know if I'm going to say their name wrong, which, by the way, that's a great side note. Always ask the person how you pronounce their name. I do it. Even if their name looks like it's going to be Jane Doe, I still ask them, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Because there's been times where I did not say someone's name correctly and I felt really idiotic afterwards. So that's like a little side note. Like, always ask, like, hey, is this how you say your name? No one's going to think you're an idiot if you do that. They're probably going to think you're an idiot if you say their name wrong. and it was a really obvious mistake. So I'm just throwing that out there. But if you focus on the why of your conversation, all of those nerves are still probably going to be there. Like, they're not going to 100% go away, but that why is propelling you forward, and it's going to be a lot more convincing reason to keep going with the interview, right? Like, you're not going to sit there and say, oh, I'm so nervous, but we're about to have this life-changing interview. Oh, but I can't do it because I'm too nervous. Right? Like, when the content is that good, you just got to push past it. You got to push past. I mean, it's almost like it's fear, you just have to, the only way around it is through it. Like, that's the only way to get over it is just to push through it, like maybe jump up and down or listen to a song to get you in the mood to do a great interview. But I mean, like, I promise you can get through it and it will get easier. The more you do these interviews, it's going to get easier. But another thing I want you to think about is remember to ask questions that will make your guest more relatable to your audience, because you want to bring up stories that you know about your guest that can make them more approachable or more understandable or just simply more human. So you may not know this person on a deep personal level. Like I said, maybe you've only interacted a few times through Messenger or through email, but hopefully you have a little bit of their backstory. Like, part of their journey. So ask questions that will bring out the humanity in the conversation, right? It doesn't need to just be facts and figures because, guys, it's so boring. It's so boring if all you're doing is talking at your audience and you're not trying to pull them into the conversation. Like, you want to pull them into the story and say, oh, I remember what it was like when my kid was a toddler and I was trying to go to medical school, or I remember when I was trying to help take care of my aging parents as well. And you see what I'm saying? Like, just bringing out some of that relatability is going to make your interviews so much stronger for your audience. Like, they are going to connect. They're going to be hanging on your every words. So just remember that. But I know I find it refreshing when I'm listening to a podcast and I hear about a mistake that someone made who, like, you would think they never, ever make mistakes, right? Like, you just think, oh, this person is perfect. Like, they've hit the point in their career that I want to be one day. But if I'm listening to a podcast and they say, oh yeah, man, I screwed up so much in my early years, it's just like, oh man, that just makes me feel more understood, right? Like, and sometimes that's all we need is just to feel understood. Like, you get it. You get, like, this is just personal, transparency for me is when someone says, hey, I know what it's like to have 3 young kids. I'm like, ooh, I'm listening because I have 3 young kids right now. So if they bring in that relatability, it's refreshing. And I end up liking that person a lot more and wanting to follow them and consume their content because they get me and they understand my situation. So real fast, while we're talking about podcast interviews, I want to mention that I do have a free resource. So if you're thinking about doing podcast interviews, or you've already started and you're kind of thinking, okay, I need to have better questions, I have a resource that is 10 questions you can ask any guest on your podcast. And that's at crystalprofit.com/tips and strategies. And y'all, I'm telling you, like, you could literally ask anyone these questions, like, no matter your topic, no matter your industry. These are just great fillers if you're creating some podcast interview questions and you're like, man, I need to go deeper with this person, but I don't really know how. Then hopefully these questions will help you just kind of get the creative juices flowing and help you really kind of get into a groove. But now I want to cover the actual interview process. I told y'all I would tell you these are the things that I actually do, like, in my mind whenever I'm doing an interview with someone. So I have 10 things to share with you. Well, I wrote down 10 and then I thought of one more that was probably more important than all the other ones. So that's like a bonus one, but I'm going to give you that one first. But then I have 10 things to share with you that actually go through my mind throughout the entire interview process. So the first thing I want you to think about is set an intention for the interview as well as a timeline for how long you're going to talk. Like, this is the number one thing. So what do I mean by setting an intention? I mean, what are you hoping to get out of this conversation with your guest? Are you trying to get them to give you insight into their world? Like, are they further along in the journey than your audience is? And you're trying to, kind of get them to look back on their own journey and like mistakes that they made? Or are you trying to get them to share some of the behind the scenes of their life or their business for your audience? Are you trying to get them to share something motivational? Like, what is the actual purpose of this interview? So before you ever hit record or start the call and really like get into the nitty-gritty of the conversation, make sure that you have set an intention for the actual interview that's about to happen. And then the timeline is so, so important. And I didn't realize other people's brains, like, this is what I'm saying, like, this is all the stuff that goes on in my head because this is the way that I'm wired. I'm naturally a punctual person. I know it drives my husband crazy because he's just like, I'm very routine. I'm very, okay, we got to be on time. And by on time, I mean 5 or 10 minutes early. Like, this is something, it's how I've always been. So, I really take my guests' time into consideration. I, appreciate them coming on, and I want to make sure that I'm mindful of their time and my time and everyone's time. So depending on how long your show is, you want to know exactly how long you're going to talk to this person. And you want to make sure that they know ahead of time how long the interview potentially is going to be. So for me and this podcast, my interviews tend to last between 30 minutes to an hour. And I know that's kind of like a long range, but I let the conversation flow naturally. I have a thought in my head that says, well, if we go over time, we can always split this episode into 2, right? So it doesn't have to be a 1 2-hour long episode. If we're talking and the conversation is good, it's relevant to, what we're doing here, like, then that's fine. And then I have another thought that says, I'm going to at least drag every ounce, like pulling teeth, right? And I've had interviews like that where you're just like pulling every single ounce of information out of this conversation for at least 30 minutes. Like, that is my goal, is to have a minimum of 30 minutes of content and at the most an hour. And now, like I said, if we go over, that's okay. I'm willing to say, okay, we're going to split this conversation into 2 episodes. I actually haven't had to do that. I've only had a few conversations go over an hour, But it's definitely something I always have that in the back of my mind. Like if we need to, I don't want to cut somebody off if we're into something really good, but I definitely want it to be at least 30 minutes. So set your intention and set your time limit before you ever hit record. Okay, so we've talked about that. Like I said, that was like my bonus one. That was the most important and didn't actually go, like whenever I was doing my outline, that actually didn't even make it into the initial 10 until afterwards. And I was like, oh my gosh, Crystal, that's the most important part. So I had to go back and add that. So now let's get on to the actual interview process. So the first thing that I do, and if you've been listening for a while, you know why I do this. So the first thing I do is you have to check your equipment. No matter what, if you're doing a solo episode, if you're doing an interview, you absolutely have to check your equipment. Even right before I started recording this episode, I noticed that my microphone setting, for some reason, it always, whenever I open my Audacity and I'll turn on my mic, it goes back to the default settings and my mic volume is like way too loud. Y'all know I'm loud. Like I have to turn my mic down to like 60% when I'm recording my podcast because I'm loud. And I'm not like, if I were to sit here and try to talk by quietening my voice, like you can tell that's not me. No, I'm loud. I own it. I don't even care. Like I adjust my equipment to account for my loudness. But like I said, if you've been listening for a while, then you know the horror story of my very first podcast interview. Oh my gosh, y'all, I did not check my equipment. I totally screwed up, and luckily I was able to save the audio. But my microphone wasn't even plugged in. Like I cringe a little bit every time I say that because like lesson learned, that I messed up, but it makes me cringe just a little bit because it was totally my fault. But I wish I could blame it on somebody else because that would just make me feel less stupid in the whole situation. But I fully own it. It was my fault. So now I always check my equipment before I do a podcast interview, a live video, or anything else. So the next thing that you're going to do is connect to your Zoom meeting. I've had a few people asking about what do I use for my podcast interviews, and I'm going to link to a resource that Buzzsprout did that is really, really good. It's about how to do remote interviews because some people say that they like to use Zoom. Other people like to use other ones. So depending on where you are at in your journey and what your capabilities are and what you feel comfortable with, I want you to have a few options. I personally use Zoom. It's worked really well for me and I enjoy the platform a lot. But I'm going to link to their resource. That way they have a few other ones on there that I personally haven't used, but I mean, it's Buzzsprout. I recommend all the resources that they share because they know what they're doing. So check that out if you want to explore some other options for doing your podcast interviews. But the third thing that I do is I adjust the volume like once we're connected into Zoom. So I make sure that I can hear them, they can hear me, and then we're just going to roll right into step number 4, which is I make sure that their equipment sounds good. So I don't require, obviously, because I can't make anybody do anything, right? Come on, guys. I have a 3-year-old. I know I can't make anybody do anything. So what I'll do is I will make sure that their equipment sounds good, but I request, that's a better way to say it, like instead of make them, I request that guests use their earbuds, if they have any earbuds with a microphone, because I'm not interviewing, like everybody that I interview doesn't have a studio setup or they don't have a podcast mic. So the earbuds that are on, the microphone that comes standard on most earbuds are fine for a podcast interview. I mean, I'm not going to tell somebody you have to go out and buy a podcast microphone in order to be on my podcast because I'm not an elitist and I don't believe in having my guests do that, right? Like that's kind of crazy. If you said, oh, you can come be on my podcast, but you must go buy $100 microphone. Otherwise, like I feel like I should raise my pinky while I say that because I'm super fancy. And no, that's not me. That's not me. Maybe that's someone else's podcast, but that's not me. It's not what I teach other people. I teach whatever is going to render the best sounding quality audio that you can do, then that's what you should go with. But okay, so let's move on. So you're checked your equipment, you're connected to Zoom, everything sounds great. The fifth thing you're going to do is chat with them for a few minutes just to kind of calm everyone's nerves. Like I always imagine being at like a dinner party and you meet someone for the first time and you're just kind of getting to know them. I mean, I think it should be a little bit deeper than like, well, how's the weather there? Like just surface level stuff. But I mean, you want to kind of calm everybody's nerves because if this is your first podcast interview and it's their first podcast interview, I can't say that for some reason, first podcast interview, then everybody's going to be kind of a little like,
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants. Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
I don't really know what I'm doing. Well, I don't really know what I'm doing, like I wouldn't say that. If this is your first podcast interview, don't tell them that it's your first podcast interview. Unless you do know them, then that's fine. But if this is someone you don't know, don't tell them it's your first podcast interview. Just be confident. You can do this, but chat with them and make everybody feel comfortable, even if it takes, y'all, sometimes I've chatted with someone for like 20 minutes before we ever actually start recording, and that's totally fine. Okay, so the next thing, number 6, is start recording and look at the clock. So you want to make sure you know exactly what time you started the interview so you can pace yourself and ask your questions accordingly. So that's actually number 7, is you want to pace yourself through your questions. So you started recording, you're looking at the clock. Let's say you started right at 3 o'clock and you're looking down and you're like, okay, it's 3:15. I wanted this interview to be about 45 minutes. So we got about 30 minutes left, but I have 10 questions we still need to cover. Plus I need to give them a few minutes to promote their stuff. Like, okay, we got to kind of get going through this. So maybe you pick, 4 questions instead of the rest of the 10 that you were going to do. Does that make sense? Like if at any time none of this makes sense, make sure message me and tell me, Crystal, I still need help with podcast interviews because I have no issue. Like I said, I've been doing this for a long time and I would love to help you get your podcast interviews set up and help you through the process. So, but pacing yourself through your questions is just making sure that you stay on track. Ask the most important questions that you know will add value to your podcast and to your audience. And then kind of leave the ones that are surface level until the very end. I think that the questions that make your guests more relatable or offer more value to your audience are more important than like, what is your dog's name? If that's relatable to your podcast, and I think that's great, but if it's not, then let's skip over that one. Okay, so number 8 is give them an opportunity to promote themselves, their products or their services, or their business. So they've come onto your podcast for a reason. Maybe they're trying to promote their book, or maybe they're just trying to grow their platform, grow their social media, grow their email list, whatever it is. So they've come there, for those purposes. I know that is one of the reasons why I've done guest interviews, is because I wanted people to know more about this podcast. So give them an opportunity, even if it's a short segment, maybe just 2 or 3 minutes, then I think that that is something that every podcast host should do. It's kind of like being a gracious host. You want to give them the opportunity, like they came onto your podcast and it's giving you valuable content to share with your audience. So the least that you can do is let them share something. Let them share. I don't even care. I'll let my guest talk about your live event, talk about your Facebook group, talk about your freebie, talk about all the things, because they have just delivered amazing content to my audience, because I only look for good quality guests that are going to deliver valuable content. Okay, so number 9 is thank them for coming on the show. I believe that you should do this within the actual part, like where you're recording. You should say, man, thank you so much for coming on the show and offering so much value. Or you could even say something specific, like a main takeaway that they shared that was really interesting for you, and just share that. Just say, hey, thank you so much for telling me about XYZ, because I really think the audience is going to appreciate that. And then the 10th thing is stop recording and follow up with all of the air dates and the other additional information that they need to know. So I tend to we'll stop recording and then we'll chat for a few minutes. If they need to go immediately, I've had times where it's I'm glad the interview is done. I have to go get my kid from school, or I have to do this. I totally understand, but you still want to follow up in whichever way y'all initially started communicating. So whether that was through Facebook Messenger, through email, don't switch platforms. Just stick with whatever it is that they feel most comfortable, and tell them, hey, by the way, this is when your podcast is going to air, and this is when, here's the graphic that I'm going to use if you want to share that beforehand, or if you have any other additional links. I know I've had guests that will come on and maybe their episode doesn't air for several weeks later. I'll message them the week of and say, hey, your episode's about to go live. Do you have any other things that you want me to add to the show notes for this episode, right? Because the podcast at that point is probably fully edited, but I can always add additional things. This is what I love about show notes, is you can add even a year from now if you had something. Maybe they switched their Instagram account, or maybe they have a different Facebook group, or maybe they created a Facebook group and they want to add it on there. That's totally fine with me. I'd be happy to update that for you. So just make sure that you follow up with them with all the air dates and anything else. And just another side note, I think it's really cool to thank your guest in some way, send them a thank you letter, send them, even if it's just a thank you email, at the very, very least, you should send them something that says, thank you so much for taking your time to share with me, my audience, the podcast. We really appreciate, just say something really genuine. Just a very genuine thank you can go a long, long way. So that does it for the podcast interview mindset. So I'm going to do a quick recap. So we talked about how do you prepare to talk to someone you've never met. And we talked about it is okay. It is 100% normal to be a little nervous. So you may be nervous, they may be nervous, and maybe you even need to say that to them, is hey, if you're nervous, it's okay, because we're going to chat about this for a few minutes. The other thing we talked about is knowing your why for the conversation you're about to have. So why are you doing this? And then set your intention and your time limit before you ever get on the call. And then I'm going to breeze through quickly the 10 things that are actually what needs to happen in the actual interview process. So you got to check your equipment, connect to Zoom or whatever platform you're using, adjust the volumes, make sure everything sounds good, chat for a few minutes to kind of calm everyone's nerves, start recording and look at the clock at the same time, pace yourself through the questions, let them promote themselves, make sure that you thank them, and follow up with any additional information. So that's it, guys. That is the podcast interview mindset. That is what goes through my mind anytime I do a podcast interview. But that does it for this episode. So if this is your first time tuning in, I'd love for you to subscribe and hear what other fun things we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. And another thing that would be really cool is if you could go leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. Tell me what you love about this episode, or tell me which episode is your favorite, or tell me what other topics that you want to hear us talk about. But be sure to sign up for the free 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp and check out the other great resources we have in the resource library. And the show notes for this episode are at crystalprofit.com/episode 86. But remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.